Imagine stepping into the cockpit of like a commercial airliner, right? You're looking at the dashboard and you realize the pilot has intentionally turned off one of the main engines mid-flight.
Yeah, that would definitely cause some
Yeah,
immediate panic.
right. Just for a split second, you'd panic. But then you notice they are rerouting all that remaining power to this experimental, hyper-efficient thruster they just installed.
So they're basically betting the entire plane on this one new piece of technology.
Exactly. They are betting the plane. And that is the exact sensation you get when reading the document we're looking at today. We are doing a deep dive into the unaudited financial results for the first half of fiscal year 2026. So the period ended March 31st, 2026 for a company called Origin Agritech Limited.
And it is a document that completely defies traditional financial gravity. I mean, it really does.
It's wild. For context for you listening, Origin is an ag tech company. They operate heavily in the Chinese market, though they're legally incorporated in the British Virgin Islands.
Right. And instead of presenting, a standard ledger of steady growth, they've handed us a blueprint of a radical corporate metamorphosis.
Which is exactly our mission today. We want to read between the lines of this incredibly dense, JAP-compliant document to figure out what it actually looks like mechanically, financially, legally, when an established company risks its entire existence to commercialize a brand new proprietary product.
Because a pivot of this magnitude, it doesn't just show up as a footnote. It rewrites the entire financial DNA of the organization.
Yeah, every single line item changes.
Exactly. Every line item becomes a proxy for their strategic intent.
Yeah.
You don't make the kind of structural changes Origin Agritech is making unless you believe you are holding a royal flush. Or, well, unless you believe your legacy business model is just entirely doomed.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the very first data point in this report is it's that engine getting shut off.
Revenue drop.
Right, the revenue drop. For this 6-month period, Origin's net revenue just plummeted. I mean, they went from 72.3 million RMB down to 49.2 million RMB compared to the same period last year.
Which is a massive contraction. That drops them down to about 7.1 million US dollars.
Yeah. And if you are an investor scanning the top line, your immediate instinct is like, oh, this company is losing market share or they're failing to execute.
But what's fascinating here is that the report plainly states this revenue collapse is deliberate. They are actively dismantling a major segment of their operations.
Specifically what they call their external seed tolling service, right?
Yes. And to understand why a company would willingly slaughter a cash cow like that, we have to look at the mechanics of seed tolling. It is fundamentally a high-volume, low-margin processing game.
And so they're just contractors.
Exactly. You take raw agricultural product from another entity, you dry it, you treat it, you package it, and you hand it back. You don't own it.
It's sort of the agricultural equivalent of being like Foxconn manufacturing iPhones for Apple.
That's a perfect analogy, yeah.
You get paid for the labor and the facility, but you don't own the underlying intellectual property. The massive profit margin goes to the company whose logo is on the box.
Or in this case, the company that engineered the biological traits of the seed. Origin is walking away from that contract manufacturing money because they want to be Apple. They want to sell their own proprietary high-margin corn seed.
And that transition, it requires a brutal reallocation of resources.
Oh, absolutely. In the ag tech space, capture the IP premium, meaning the extra money farmers are willing to pay for a seed that promises, say, higher yield or better pest resistance. That's the only way to achieve exponential valuation.
Because the tolling provides steady cash flow, but it just caps your growth.
Exactly. By reducing their tolling volume, they are forcing a structural evolution.
But the reality of forcing that evolution is that it leaves a massive gap in your cash flow. You can't just flip a switch from low-margin services to high-margin IP sales overnight.
Right, you still have to keep the lights on.
So how does a company survive a deliberate revenue drop of that severity? Well, looking at their operating expenses reveals the sheer mechanical force of this pivot.
It's all in the OpEx.
Yeah, their total operating expenses dropped by 44%, landing at 18.4 million RMB. And the primary driver of that is just an absolute bloodbath in their general and administrative expenses.
Which fell by a staggering 70%.
Yeah, from 25 million RMB down to just 7.6 million RMB.
I mean, cutting 70% of your administrative overhead isn't just trimming the fat, It is amputating limbs.
It really is.
We're talking about severing back-office functions, consolidating management, stripping the corporate infrastructure down to the absolute studs. But the genius, or maybe the madness of this strategy, is revealed in where they're redirecting the surviving capital.
Right, because while the back office is getting gutted, their selling and marketing expenses shot up by 93%, hitting 5.1 million RMB.
And their R&D went up too, right?
Yeah, research and development expenses increased by 11%, reaching 5.7 million RMB.
Are they basically just cutting the corporate fat to aggressively fund the muscle?
That is exactly what they're doing. The source material specifies that the 93% surge in marketing is directly tied to hiring specialized sales personnel to push these new proprietary corn seeds.
Which makes sense.
It does. It illustrates a profound shift in corporate psychology. A tolling business relies on a few massive institutional contracts. But a proprietary seed business requires a sprawling, aggressive ground game.
You need actual people out there.
Right. You need sales reps out in the rural provinces convincing individual farming cooperatives to abandon their traditional seed suppliers and take a huge risk on your new genetically optimized product.
And amazingly, because they swung the axe so hard on those administrative costs, their overall operating loss actually improved by 47.8%.
Wait, it improved? Yeah. They brought the operating loss down to 12.9 million RMB. So the top line looks disastrous, but structurally, the company is actually bleeding less cash from its core operations than it was a year ago.
That's incredible. It's a textbook maneuver for commercializing a new technology, and they are executing it with almost reckless aggression.
But a sales army needs something to sell, right?
Right. Obviously.
Yeah.
And in agriculture, the product isn't a digital download. It is a biological organism that requires physical manufacturing, processing, warehousing.
Which brings us to the balance sheet, because this is where the physical reality of Origin's pivot becomes incredibly tangible. If you're hiring all these reps to push a proprietary corn seed, you better have a mountain of it ready to ship.
And they do. Their total inventory is up 72%, sitting at 24.8 million RMB.
But the critical clue is the composition of that inventory. Their finished goods category skyrocketed from a mere 608,000 RMB back in September 2025 to over 14.2 million RMB by March 2026.
Wow. That 14.2 million RMB is the physical manifestation of this entire corporate strategy. That's their war chest.
But we have to think about the unique risk profile here, right? Because unlike a warehouse full of, smartphones or steel auto parts.
Corn seeds are living organisms.
Exactly. They have a biological ticking clock.
They require strict temperature and humidity controls just to maintain their germination viability. If you hoard 14 million RMB worth of seed and fail to sell it within the planting window,
you're in big trouble.
Yeah, you don't just discount it next season. You often have to write it off entirely because the biological efficacy degrades.
Which makes the timing of this pivot so much more intense. They are literally racing against the agricultural calendar.
They are.
And you can see them fully committing to this proprietary pipeline by looking at their supplier relationships. Their prepayments for purchasing seed from outside suppliers completely cratered.
Dropping from 19 million RMB down to 6.1 million RMB.
Yep. At the exact same time, their deposits for internal R&D jumped from 1.1 million to 3.6 million RMB.
So they have effectively severed their reliance on third-party genetics. The whole supply chain has been re-engineered.
Yeah, the drop in prepayments basically confirms they are no longer fronting cash to buy other people's biological IP.
They're betting exclusively on the genetics developed in their own labs, which we see in that spike in R&D deposits.
But engineering genetics, warehousing millions in living inventory, and funding a massive sales team that burns cash rapidly, especially when your legacy revenue is evaporating.
Right. You have to fund that gap somehow.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the way Origin Agritech is financing this gap phase is highly unorthodox.
Unorthodox is a good word for it.
Yeah, the related party transactions section of the report reveals this web of insider funding that is keeping the company afloat.
Corporate transitions of this magnitude require immense liquidity, and Origin has leaned heavily on its internal ecosystem. The balance sheet shows 26 million RMB owed to related parties.
And it's deeper than just related parties, it's highly personal. They owe 13.9 million RMB directly to their own shareholders, with some of these loans carrying interest rates between 4.5 and 6%.
Yeah.
They owe millions to the chairman's close family members and entities controlled by them, like this one company called Yingdi.
Yeah, the insider lending is extensive.
But I have to push back hard on this structure for a second, because isn't it a huge red flag for you as a listener evaluating evaluating a company to see it borrowing cash directly from the chairman's family at 6% interest.
It definitely raises eyebrows.
Especially considering Origin has a total equity deficit of over 75.5 million RMB. The company literally owes more than its assets are worth.
Which is a precarious position to be in.
And to make it worse, they recorded a 17.1 million RMB allowance for credit loss tied to a company called Beijing Shihui, which, surprise, is also owned by the chairman's family.
Ah, yeah.
So they're essentially writing off millions in debt owed by the chairman's family while simultaneously borrowing from them at high interest. I mean, how is this not a completely toxic financial structure?
Well, it looks bad on paper, sure. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of the Chinese corporate credit market, the mechanics become clear, even if they do remain highly risky.
Okay, walk me through that.
So you are entirely correct that a 75.5 million RMB equity deficit makes traditional debt financing nearly impossible. A company with negative equity is technically insolvent, and traditional state-owned banks in China are notoriously risk-averse when dealing with high-tech agriculture firms operating with negative equity.
But they do have some bank loans on the books. The report lists a 4.95 million RMB loan from the Agricultural Bank of China at 3%, and a 3 million RMB loan from ICBC at 3.3%. So they can get cheap capital.
They can, but look at the friction involved there. Those bank loans are secured by tangible assets. Origin had to pledge specific property and land use rights just to secure those relatively small 3% loans.
And that takes time.
Exactly. The underwriting process takes months. When you are burning cash to maintain temperature-controlled warehouses for 14 million RMB in biological inventory, and you need to fund a rapidly expanding sales force, you cannot wait 6 months for a bank committee to appraise your land rights.
Oh, I see. So the chairman's family essentially becomes the lender of last resort.
Precisely. In the Chinese business ecosystem, this web of related party debt acts as rapid deployment capital. It is unsecured, it's highly flexible, and it can be wired on demand.
Even with those high interest rates.
Yes, the 4.5 to 6% interest rates are higher than the bank rates, but they reflect the massive unsecured risk the insiders are taking to float a company with a 75.5 million RMB equity deficit.
That makes sense.
The related parties are acting as the ultimate shock absorbers. They're providing a bridge loan across that chasm between the old tolling business and the future proprietary seed revenue.
Okay, but a bridge loan implies you eventually reach the other side. What if the bridge collapses?
That is the multi-million-dollar question.
Because the entirety of this corporate strategy, the 70% cuts to admin, the 14 million RMB in hoarded seeds, the high interest loans from the chairman's family, it all relies on one singular assumption.
That Origin Agritech actually has the legal right to sell the seeds they just manufactured.
Right, and that assumption is currently under severe legal threat. This is where the biological complexity of ag tech just slams into the rigidity of the legal system.
Yeah, the IP battlefield is fascinating here.
It's crazy. The commitments and contingencies section of the report details this massive trapdoor. Origin's subsidiary, Hubei Ayu, is locked in a high-stakes legal battle with a competitor, Hebei Ayu Breeding Industry Group.
And the allegation is pretty severe.
Yeah, the competitor alleges that Origin's flagship new corn seed, a variety called Liu 16, infringes on their plant new variety rights for a seed called Liu 88.
Which raises such an important question about how we define and defend intellectual property. We're so used to patent disputes over lines of software code or the mechanical design of a microchip.
Sure.
But litigating plant variety rights is incredibly murky. You are literally dealing with the genetic code of a living organism.
So how does a court even adjudicate that? Do they just, sequence the DNA of the two corn seeds and compare them?
Well, DNA fingerprinting is part of it. But in China, agricultural IP disputes heavily rely on what's called DUS testing.
DUS testing.
Yeah, it stands for distinctness, uniformity, and stability. They actually have to plant the seeds, grow the crops, and observe the morphological traits out in the field.
Wow. So they're literally growing the evidence.
Exactly. Does it grow to the same height? Does it resist the same pests? Do the kernels have the exact same moisture content? It is a slow, deeply complex scientific evaluation.
And the evaluation has not gone well for Origin so far.
No, it hasn't.
In April 2024, the Intermediate People's Court ruled against Origin's subsidiary. They judged that they did infringe on the competitor's rights. The court ordered them to pay 3 million RMB in economic losses, which Origin has already accrued on their balance sheet.
Yeah, they took the hit on paper. Accruing that 3 million RMB liability indicates their auditors believe the financial loss is probable.
Right.
But the penalty itself isn't the existential threat here. The true threat is the injunction.
Oh, because if they lose the right to sell Liu 16, that 14.2 million RMB in finished goods sitting in their warehouses instantly transforms from a war chest into a massive decaying liability.
Exactly. And Origin is currently appealing this to the Intellectual Property Court of the Supreme People's Court.
So the entire corporate pivot is essentially on pause, waiting for a panel of judges in Beijing to decide if one stalk of corn looks too genetically similar to another.
It is. And the uncertainty of that Supreme Court appeal is generating extreme friction for the company's external lifelines.
You're talking about the investor deal.
Yes, the financial report details a critical pending transaction from February 2026. Origin struck a deal to sell 2 million ordinary shares to outside investors for $2.8 million US.
Which was supposed to be the massive cash injection they needed to finally replace those high-interest insider loans we talked about.
Right, but the report notes the first installment of $2.1 million was paid by the investors in February.
But as of late May 2026, when this document was actually published, Origin hadn't even issued the shares yet.
Yeah, the investors wired the money, but the equity hasn't changed hands.
That is wild.
It highlights the extreme hesitation surrounding the company. You have investors floating millions of dollars in a holding pattern, fully aware that the Supreme People's Court holds the fate of the company's flagship asset.
Right, because if the court rules against Origin, the valuation of those 2 million shares just plummets instantly.
The entire capital structure is effectively holding its breath.
So synthesizing this document, what does this all mean for you listening? Origin Agritech provides this absolute masterclass in extreme corporate pivoting.
They really do.
I mean, they intentionally gutted a reliable 72 million RMB revenue stream. They fired a massive portion of their administrative staff to fund an army of sales reps. They're operating with a staggering 75.5 million RMB equity deficit.
While keeping the lights on by borrowing millions at premium interest rates from the chairman's own family.
Exactly. And they are using that borrowed time and borrowed money to hoard over 14 million RMB worth of living, breathing corn seeds, all while battling in the Supreme Court for the right to actually monetize them.
It is a phenomenal demonstration of how a balance sheet tells a story of survival, risk, and biological constraints.
It really redefines what we consider high-risk tech.
It does. And perhaps the most compelling takeaway from this specific deep dive extends far beyond Origin Agritech's balance sheet.
Oh, how so?
Well, when we discuss high-stakes intellectual property and national strategy, the conversation is almost entirely dominated by artificial intelligence and semiconductors, right?
Right, the usual suspects.
But consider the macro environment Origin is operating in. A rapidly changing climate, shifting precipitation patterns, and a nation striving for absolute food security for 1.4 billion people on a shrinking footprint of arable land.
That is a massive challenge.
It is.
Yep.
And in the coming decades, the ultimate geopolitical asset won't just be the microchip. It'll be the proprietary, drought-resistant, high-yield seed. The fierce legal battles over who owns the biological code inside a single kernel of corn aren't just corporate disputes. They're the early proxy wars for control over the 21st century food supply.